I'm really excited to bring you my 10 heroes of water. These are 10 people from all around the world, incredible stories where they took their destiny into their own hands. They took action on their ground and in their community to make a real meaningful difference. So I want to start with Sepp Holzer, my mentor, my guide, known as the Rebel Farmer, and he was an Austrian mountain farmer who really looked at nature first for answers. He looked at nature as the ultimate truth and guide for his work and tried to model his interactions to fit around nature's framework. And it's been incredible to learn right at his footsteps and see how to use equipment, how to use our own interventions, the resources we have available to work in symbiosis with nature to reach a better goal. And to know how to see landscape, how to read ecological potential, and be able to visualize what changes could be made and how those might impact the landscape at large. And he's created incredible examples all over the world. The Krameterhof, the farm where he was born and where he was raised. Here he created a network of 72 interconnected ponds and water bodies that feed the water throughout the landscape. They have diverse vegetation, agroforestry systems, and abundant amounts of food and fodder for the animals and humans that live there. They really provide an example of how even the most barren, harsh landscapes can be cultivated with nature to a really productive end goal. And he's really well known for using equipment, using technology. We've had excavators and bulldozers destroy so much of the natural world, and we've degraded it so heavily that we have to use some of this equipment to offset these impacts, to set up the landscape to age better for the next generations to come. And we have to do it in tune with nature. We have to look to nature as our guide along that journey so that we make sure our actions are really in harmony with the surrounding world. Another hero, a great inspiration and mentor of mine, Rajendra Singh, known as the Waterman of India. Now, Rajendra is an amazing story. He was going to this harsh, desertified landscape, but he revived this huge region to a point of health. How was it done? Well, he was originally a doctor, and he was sent to this region, Golpapura, and there all the young people had left because there was no water, there was no agriculture, there was no work. And he was treating the old people that remained for the night blindness. And they suffered from the night blindness from their malnutrition. And eventually he came to realize that to help these people, he had to not bring them medicine, but bring them water. He had to restore the vitality of the landscape. And an elder showed him the way, showed him how to revive the traditional structures. And so he was laughed at first, a doctor digging in the earth, but he created this first johad by hand. This is the traditional type of way that they managed water before colonial times in India. Now, when the rains came, the johad filled up and they had water, but even more interesting, the wells downstream were recharged with water. And now they had water not just in the wet season, but in the dry season as well. These wells that had been dry now were full of water once again. And so by holding the seasonal rains, getting these heavy monsoonal rains, storing them and returning them to the ground, we can then feed and improve the hydrology that we can harvest later as springs or wells and tap into that aquifer. And so through this work, they've restored 7 rivers that were dry, now are running year round. They've brought water back to 250,000 wells, impacting 1 million people, causing the reverse migration back to the countryside because now agriculture was viable once again. Then one of my very favorite heroes, Wangari Maathai, the mother of trees in Kenya. And Wangari has an amazing story. When she was growing up in rural Africa, there was this big fig tree growing, and from below it came the spring that they used for water in the family. Her mother always told her, when you're gathering firewood, don't gather from that tree because that tree is a tree of God. She didn't understand at the time, but through time she began to understand how this tree was a tree of God. It was producing the water that was giving life to the landscape. So she looked at what she could do to help impact the landscape at large, and she looked at planting trees, and she saw how if she planted trees and got people to value trees, she could restore these water sources. She could give people the fuel they need for cooking, and people would have material, they would have shelter, they would have everything they need. So she started a movement, paying women a small stipend for every time that they planted a tree. And at first, they were bringing them trees and having them plant, but then they realized they would become dependent. So instead, they taught them how to forage seeds in the native forest and plant those seeds out. And for every seed that became a tree planted on a landscape, the woman received a small stipend that she could help feed her family with. And so this movement started to gain steam. Women were able to do something that positively benefited their environment and positively benefited their families as well. And so this started to pass on and really gain steam, and women were teaching their children. And at first, the people who taught them how to plant trees said, "Oh, you can't do this. You're just a bunch of women. You need a university degree to plant trees." But they did it anyway, and they were quite successful. They started to have these huge nurseries and plant whole forests, and the community gained a lot of steam. And through it, this women's empowerment movement started to grow. Women and communities started to see that the issues they were facing were not from the government, were not from outside, but they were from their own previous management. And if they changed how they were working with the landscape, they could resolve the problems and issues they were facing. And so this community organizing became really important. It became really important for people to understand that they had been misled, that it was their own actions delivering themselves to places they didn't want to go, and it was their responsibility to get off of the bus and start going in a different direction. Up next, another Austrian, Victor Schauberger, known as the Water Wizard. And he really had an incredible understanding of water. He was a forester who spent his time observing and learning from nature, and again, treated nature as his ultimate guide. And he learned some key innovations from the forest. And he saw how in the healthy forest, the water cycle was charged, and it led to all this spring water and healthy abundance of life in the springs and streams and creeks and rivers. But when the land was cleared and clear-cut, the soil became hot and dry, and the water wasn't able to infiltrate. And so it ran off quickly downhill, leading to flooding and erosion, but then followed by drought and fire. And so he called this the full and the half water cycle. And he really saw that the forests were responsible for providing the drinking water, the resources, the life, the fish for the communities. And he really was at a lot of concurrence with science. He understood so much, and he was able to show up all of the scientists of his time, yet he was unschooled. And so they really disdained him for this. And he understood how today's science thinks too primitively, indeed. It could be said that its thinking is an octave too low. And in an almost comedical way, he said, "I think it would have been much better had Newton contemplated how the apple got up there in the first place." And so he used everything he learned from the landscape and tried to actualize it. How trout were moving upstream, how these currents and flows helped bring vitality to the animal. And he really understood something elemental about the structure of water and this electrical potential that we're just beginning to understand with this fourth phase exclusion zone, liquid crystalline water. Another great hero, Zephaniah Phiri Maseko, known as the rainwater harvester. And now early on, again, a lot of political trouble in these African regions, and he was an advocate for democracy. So he was actually blacklisted. He was fired from his job, told that he couldn't work anymore. He had this family to support, and all he had was this rocky piece of ground in the Bible. And so he started looking at how he could work with the natural forces, the forces of God that he was reading in the Bible, and use this landscape to produce what he needed for his family. During colonial times, there were all these drainage systems put in place so that it didn't flood, but in a place so dependent on the rainfall for agriculture, this made them really prone to drought. And so what he did is he started making places to hold the water. And so his movement started to spread. People started to see what he was doing and how his gardens were so productive, and they started to model these behaviors. He started to teach his surrounding community. And this area started to grow, and they started to develop their own watershed. Because every time it rained, they were feeding that water into the earth. They were digging down to the bedrock and making these places to store the water, to infiltrate it, to greet it to the landscape. He calls them his immigration centers, where he brings the water and immigrates it into the earth. And they started getting larger and larger, and over his life, he developed this really productive oasis that you see here, where at the top in the rocky areas, even up there, he was infiltrating the water and then making more humid and fertile ground as he moved down, eventually leading to ponds where he was growing fish and helping feed his community. And so he's a beautiful example of what's possible. Really simple man, simple tools, but was able to make this productive oasis for his family and his community. Another great leader, Josephine Medamon. She was an elder grandmother when she was called to this work. In her 70s, she saw what was going on with water and how it needed to have awareness brought to it. How the price of water was going up and pollution was getting so bad and clean water was starting to get so scarce. And so she started this movement walking for the water, carrying the water in a copper pail, and really starting to bring awareness to the water, to its challenges in these different areas. So she started walking all of the Great Lakes to bring awareness to the water. And it started this movement. People started to join her. People started to follow her on these walks. And so she's really inspired this whole generation of young Indigenous youth to move forward into working for water, working for life, working for a better common future. And she was called to this work as a grandmother. So no matter where you are in life, there's things you can do to make a really positive impact on your community and in this world. Erin Brockovich, another hero. I love this one because she doesn't even consider herself an activist or an environmental activist. She's just someone who saw something wrong going on and needed to speak up, needed to do something about it. So she was a single mother of 3 in her 30s, working as a legal clerk, and she started seeing really suspicious things going on. How it seemed as though these people were actually being poisoned by the municipality, PG&E, and they were trying to cover it up. And she exposed this big, really catastrophic thing where not only were they poisoning the people, contaminating the groundwater with chromium-6, but they were lying to the people and telling them it was a different one that was healthy for them. They were trying to get past the legal framework where if they knew about it for long enough, they couldn't sue about it. So very sneaky. And here's this woman, really fiery, spitbally, attractive, using everything she could to just do right by these people. And so she dug into this case. She exposed this story. And eventually she was the driving force behind the biggest settlement of this kind in law. Another great hero, Willie Smits, really an orangutan savior. And he was working as a forester in Borneo. And he saw in this market this young orangutan for sale. And later on in the day, he saw it hadn't been sold, it had actually been thrown away. And so he rescued this animal, and he saw how these animals were really calling out for help. They were in such a harsh scenario where so much of the land was being cleared for oil palm plantations. They were losing their habitat, and they had nowhere to go. And so he answered this call. He felt called to do something. He started the Masarang Foundation as an orangutan rehabilitation center. So he developed a system to give the local people a different way to cultivate the landscape. Instead of these oil palms, it's very destructive. He came across the sugar palm and how they were able to tap this tree for sugar and leave the tree growing, leave the forest growing. And so it helped the water supplies, it helped the forest, it helped the health of the soil, but it also gave the people an even better crop to grow. And so he helped develop this into a market and helped develop these systems where people now had a better livelihood, a better way to cultivate the landscape in an agroforestry system that was also providing habitat for the orangutans. Another hero and leader, Nicole Masters. Nicole is a soil consultant traveling around the world, helping people understand their soils and what's going on, helping dig into the ground and understand the soil biology, how the landscape being managed in different ways is changing the very nature of the soil biology, and how the watersheds are handling and moving water as a result. It's one thing to understand the science behind things, but it's another to be able to actualize change. And so she's really helping guide people through that process, guide people how to understand the structure of their soil, how to build the life within the soil. And it's really important, I think, for us to model ourselves after people who have practical experience, who are doing things on the land and in the ground, because these are the people that can really lead us to a better place. And our 10th heroes, Peter and Kate Marshall, farm foresters, mycologists, with an incredible system where they're growing a forest and raising a really valuable crop in black truffles within the forest. So they started out with this landscape that was just hard, pasty, degraded lands, over-abused by animals, and over time they worked that soil. They retained the water on the landscape. They developed forests where there were none before, to now they have this really productive crop that takes relatively little effort to grow. They use their dogs to harvest, and so they have this really wonderful system that they've developed. And he started closing up these erosion gullies. He made these fascias to hold water, to catch the sediment that was flowing, and to feed it back into the landscape. And so he really created this beautiful oasis now where, as it had no trees, it was hard soil, nothing growing, no life. Now it's this oasis of water features and forest, and you wouldn't even imagine it had been something else before. And it's important to mention with so many of these, it is a couple behind them. Sepp always mentions how he couldn't have done any of it without his wife. And with any of these, it took a lot of people to help create these efforts. So maybe you feel called to become one of these heroes. Maybe you can see yourself in one of these stories. Or maybe you know somebody who's like one of these heroes and you can help support them. It takes a community. There's these heroes that we can put up on a pedestal, but it takes all of us to make a real change. So no matter what scale you want to, I hope you find inspiration in these stories and ways that you can help create a better common future for your community.